He told her she was everything he'd ever wanted. But by the time the sun set on their weekend getaway, she lay bloodied and dying on a cheap motel floor. Her only crime was being herself. Backstory: Emily Carter was a 29-year-old freelance designer based in Portland, Oregon. A woman of precision and grace, she turned her tiny apartment into a haven of soft colors and clean lines. Her work featured on design blogs and niche lifestyle magazines. Behind her gentle smile and elegant digital portfolio was a long journey of self-discovery. Emily was transgender, and proud. Her transition hadn't been easy. Years of hormone therapy, surgeries, and navigating rejection taught her resilience. But she believed in honesty, in love, and in starting fresh with someone who truly saw her. That someone, she thought, might be David Ross. David, a 35-year-old construction foreman from rural Idaho, wasn't a man of many words, but his messages were filled with steady interest and country charm. They met on a dating app in early spring. Emily was hesitant at first, unsure how he'd react to her trans identity. So she delayed telling him, choosing instead to build a foundation before sharing everything. David's life was a contrast to hers. He lived in a small town where pickup trucks lined the diner parking lots, and traditional values weren't just a phrase, they were a way of life. Divorced with no kids, he spent his days managing crews and his nights scrolling through social media, where Emily's profile caught his eye. Their conversation started slow but soon turned affectionate. He liked that she listened. She liked that he made her laugh. They exchanged playlists, morning photos, and late-night dreams. Emily found herself smiling at his texts. David told her she was unlike any woman he'd ever met. But as weeks turned into months, a quiet dread gnawed at Emily. The longer she waited to tell him the truth, the harder it became. When he invited her to visit for the weekend, she knew it was time. Inciting incident. Emily packed her things in a tidy suitcase, tucked her hormone meds carefully into a side pouch, and boarded a flight to Boise. David picked her up in his Ford F-150, grinning as she stepped off the plane. He wore a flannel shirt, dusty jeans, and a nervous charm that matched hers. They drove through the wide-open Idaho landscape, golden fields stretching for miles. Their weekend was easy. They shared breakfasts at local diners and hiked quiet trails where the only sounds were their footsteps and the wind in the pines. David was warm, attentive, maybe even smitten. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt safe. They checked into a roadside motel off Highway 95 for their last night together. It was nothing fancy, 2 beds, stained carpet, a humming AC unit. But for Emily, it was a kind of intimacy she hadn't dared hope for. She reached into her bag for a bottle of water and accidentally knocked over the pouch of medications. Pills scattered across the floor. She scrambled to gather them, but David had already noticed. He picked up a label and frowned. "What's this?" he asked. Emily froze. Her heart pounded like thunder against her ribs. "I was going to tell you," she said softly. "I'm transgender." David didn't move at first. Then, slowly, his face darkened. His jaw clenched. The quiet of the room turned thick and heavy. "You lied to me," he said, voice rising. Emily tried to explain, but rage overtook him. In a blur of fists and fury, the man who had kissed her just hours earlier became her killer. The morning sun cut harshly through the thin motel curtains, casting an indifferent glow over the room where a life had just ended. It was a housekeeper named Rosa who found her. Room 8 at the Hillside Motel was supposed to be empty by 11 a.m. When no one answered her knock, Rosa used the master key and stepped into a nightmare. Emily Carter lay curled beside the bed, her face bruised, lips split, and blood pooling around her head. One of her arms was twisted unnaturally beneath her. Her suitcase sat half unzipped near the bathroom door. Rosa screamed. Within minutes, yellow tape encircled the motel. Detectives from the Ada County Sheriff's Office arrived, led by Detective Sarah Mendez, a calm, composed investigator known for piecing together violent crimes with almost surgical precision. But even she looked shaken as she surveyed the scene. There was no sign of forced entry. No defensive wound suggesting a prolonged struggle. Emily's belongings were still there: wallet, phone, laptop. Nothing had been taken. Nothing, except her life. Her ID identified her as Emily Carter of Portland. A quick search pulled up her social media, photos of her smiling at cafes, lounging with her cat, posing with design work displayed behind her. A woman with a full life. Mendez knelt beside the bed, noting something odd: 2 latex gloves, bloodied, shoved beneath the bed frame. One glove was turned inside out, as if torn off in a hurry. By the door, a boot print in a small smear of blood. Outside, the motel clerk provided security footage. Detectives gathered around the monitor in the cramped front office. The grainy footage showed Emily arriving 2 nights earlier with a man, tall, broad-shouldered, bearded. He opened the door for her, placed a hand gently on her back. They were smiling. The timestamp showed they entered room 8 at 7:42 p.m. Saturday. The next morning, only the man was seen leaving. 6:18 a.m. He wore different clothes. Alone. Face tense. In his left hand, a black plastic bag. Mendez froze the frame and snapped a photo of his face. They ran it through the system. An hour later, a match: David Ross. No criminal record. Local resident. Owner of a construction company in a nearby town. A search of Emily's phone, unlocked via Face ID, revealed dozens of messages between them. Months of conversations. Photos. Flirty emojis. Promises. The last message was sent at 2:04 a.m. Sunday: "I'm sorry. I should have told you earlier." That's when things began to fall into place, and then spiral. Detectives visited David Ross's home just after 5 p.m. Sunday. His truck was in the driveway. The same truck seen in the footage. He opened the door, visibly startled. "What's going on?" he asked, voice low, guarded. Detective Mendez spoke softly. "David Ross? We'd like to talk to you about a woman named Emily Carter." David's expression shifted instantly, from confusion to defensiveness. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You were seen with her at the Hillside Motel," she said, watching his reaction. He hesitated. "We were friends online. She lied to me." The statement made the air go still. David was brought in for questioning. During the interview, he admitted he'd met Emily online, that they'd developed a relationship, and that she'd flown out to meet him. He claimed he didn't know she was transgender until that night. When pressed about the argument, David's voice turned bitter. "She tricked me." "That's not right," he said, leaning forward. "She let me believe she was someone she wasn't." Detective Mendez remained composed. "So you killed her?" He blinked. "It wasn't like that." I snapped. "I didn't plan it." He paused. It was the heat of the moment. The confession was shocking, but not enough. Detective Mendez knew better than to rely solely on a suspect's words, especially one who was already framing himself as a victim. She needed hard evidence to ensure that justice for Emily Carter would hold up in court. While David Ross sat in an interrogation room, calm now, hands folded in front of him, her team went to work. First, they obtained a search warrant for his truck and home. The vehicle yielded immediate results. In the truck bed, tucked beneath a tarp and a coil of orange extension cord, investigators found a black plastic bag, torn, stained, and reeking faintly of bleach. Inside were bloodied latex gloves and a rag with traces of makeup. Lab tests would later confirm the blood was Emily's. Inside the glove compartment, another find, a receipt for gas, timestamped just 20 minutes after David was seen leaving the motel on surveillance footage. The gas station had its own cameras, which showed David pacing nervously outside, wiping his hands with what looked like tissues before tossing them into a trash can. That trash can was already emptied when police arrived, but the receipt, combined with his visible agitation, painted a damning picture. Back at his home, the investigation grew even darker. In a small, worn notebook by his bed, beneath bills and scattered receipts, were hand-scribbled entries. Mostly thoughts. Ramblings. One entry read, "Can't stand being lied to. Makes me feel like the whole world's turning against men like me. No more tolerance. No more softness." Another page had only one sentence, scribbled in angry block letters. "If you're not who you say you are, you deserve what you get." It wasn't a smoking gun. But it was smoke. Meanwhile, the medical examiner released Emily's autopsy report. She'd suffered severe blunt force trauma to the head, likely from being thrown against the motel wall, where investigators had found a faint smear of blood. Her ribs were fractured, and there were defensive wounds on her hands. She had tried to protect herself. She died alone, slowly, in the hours after David fled. And yet, the most haunting detail was not physical. Inside Emily's phone were unsent drafts. One, saved at 2:10 a.m. Read. "If you're reading this, I guess it didn't go well. I was scared to tell you, David, but I hoped you'd see me for who I am. I never wanted to hurt you." The text was never sent. Detective Mendez sat with that message for a long time. Back in the interrogation room, David tried to revise his story. Now, he claimed Emily had provoked him, mocked him, he said. "She laughed when I got angry." But the messages on her phone, her gentle tone, the desperate call log showing 2 unanswered 911 attempts at 2:15 and 2:17 a.m., they said otherwise. Emily hadn't mocked him. She'd been afraid. And David, despite no criminal past, had reacted with fury when his perception of reality shattered. The prosecution began preparing the case. David's defense attorney, publicly appointed, hinted at a heat-of-passion defense. Temporary insanity. An unfiltered emotional reaction. But Mendez saw through it. So did the community. Local headlines began picking up the story. Trans woman murdered in motel attack. Hate crime or tragic misunderstanding? Violence in the name of pride? Some outlets tried to remain neutral. Others, less so. Online, the discourse exploded. Some commenters demonized David. Others claimed he was deceived. But one truth remained: Emily Carter was dead. And David Ross had killed her. The courtroom was silent as David Ross was led in wearing a navy blue suit, his wrists unshackled, his expression unreadable. Gone was the gruff foreman from Idaho's backroads. In his place stood a man coached, polished, but still hollow. The trial had drawn attention far beyond the borders of the state. Journalists filled the benches. LGBTQ+ advocates gathered outside with signs reading, "Justice for Emily," and "Say her name." Nearby, a smaller countergroup held up placards with words like "biological truth" and "he was tricked." Police had set up barricades between the two crowds. The tension buzzed like static electricity. Inside, Emily's closest friends sat in the front row, among them, her older brother, Marcus Carter. He hadn't known she was traveling to Idaho. He hadn't even known David existed until detectives called him 2 days after her death. But now he sat with jaw clenched, hands folded, his grief quietly simmering. The prosecution opened strong. District Attorney Helen Woods, known for her precise, ruthless approach, laid out the case with measured clarity. A woman had come in trust and love to meet a man she'd fallen for, only to be met with hatred and violence. She told the truth. And for that, she died, Woods said. She introduced evidence methodically: the surveillance footage, the bloodied gloves, the gas station receipt, the damning journal entries. She played audio from David's confession, his voice calm as he said the words, "She tricked me." Then came the messages. The photos. The unsent text. And finally, the testimony of the forensic pathologist, who described in chilling detail the injuries Emily had suffered. The courtroom held its breath as the doctor concluded. This was not a quick death. She was alive for at least 10 minutes after the first blow. She likely understood, fully, what was happening to her. David's defense attorney, Mark Elwell, shifted uneasily in his seat. When it was his turn, he struck a different tone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the jury. "This was not a calculated murder. This was a man who reacted, poorly, tragically, to a revelation that shattered his understanding of reality. He used words like heat of passion, emotional shock, and psychological disorientation. He even cited cases where sudden disclosures had led to diminished capacity rulings. Then, carefully, he added, "My client was not a predator. He was a victim of deception." Whispers rippled through the gallery. Marcus Carter stared straight ahead, fists tight in his lap. David Ross took the stand. He wept, spoke of feeling betrayed, claimed he blacked out when he saw Emily's medications. His voice broke at the right moments. He said he still didn't understand why she had to lie. But under cross-examination, Helen Woods cut through him like ice. "You weren't confused when you packed your things, were you? When you cleaned your truck? When you threw away her blood?" David stammered. "I didn't think." "Exactly," Woods replied. "You didn't think about Emily. Only about yourself." By the end of the third day, the mood in the courtroom had shifted. Sympathy had evaporated. Even those unsure about transgender issues saw clearly, this was not about deception. This was about violence. David Ross had choices. He could have walked away. He chose murder. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Inside the courthouse, every tick of the clock felt like thunder. Outside, media vans parked shoulder to shoulder along the curb, satellite dishes pointed skyward. Protesters held vigils. Supporters of both sides argued through bullhorns. But inside that small Idaho courtroom, 12 strangers quietly debated the fate of one man, and the legacy of one woman. David Ross sat motionless beside his attorney, his face drawn, eyes sunken. Emily's brother, Marcus, had returned for closing arguments, his presence quiet but unflinching. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Will the foreperson please stand?" The courtroom held its breath. "On the count of second-degree murder, we find the defendant, David Ross, guilty." Gasps echoed. A few cheers erupted outside the doors but were quickly silenced by the bailiffs. David's face twitched, just once, then went still. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispered something no one could hear. David nodded slightly, resigned. Marcus closed his eyes and exhaled for what felt like the first time in weeks. Sentencing came a month later. During that time, the court accepted victim impact statements. Dozens were submitted, from Emily's clients, her friends, and members of the LGBTQ+ community who had followed the trial closely. When it was his turn to speak, Marcus stood in front of the court, a single folded paper in hand. "She was my sister," he began. "Not my trans sister. Not my brave sister. Just my sister. She was smart, stubborn, kind, and funny in ways that made you forget the world was cruel. And yes, she was transgender. That doesn't make her less of a woman. It makes her more of a fighter." He paused, his voice cracking. "She didn't lie to you," he said, looking directly at David. "She just hoped you'd be someone who could handle the truth." The judge delivered a firm sentence, 35 years to life, with no possibility of parole for the first 25. This court recognizes the brutality of your actions, he said. This was not a crime of confusion. It was a crime of control, of anger, and ultimately, hate. As David was led away in handcuffs, one of the courtroom sketch artists noted his expression. Not grief. Not rage. Just emptiness. The kind that comes when everything you built, your identity, your beliefs, your future, crumbles under the weight of what you've done. The courthouse steps felt strangely quiet after the verdict. Reporters clamored for statements, cameras clicked, and advocates raised their voices, but for Marcus Carter, it all seemed distant, muffled, like he was moving underwater. His sister was gone. But at least now, her story had been told. Emily Carter's funeral took place 2 weeks after the sentencing. Held at a small garden in Portland, it drew a crowd larger than her family ever expected. Former clients, neighbors, members of the local trans community, and people who had only known her through online forums arrived with flowers and handwritten notes. Some wept quietly. Others simply stood in silence, taking in the display of photos and sketches Emily had created. A printed version of her unsent final message, framed in silver, sat on a table near the altar. I never wanted to hurt you. I just wanted to be seen. That line became a kind of mantra in the weeks that followed. The LGBTQ+ community across the country rallied around Emily's story. Vigils were held in cities from Seattle to Atlanta. Hashtags bearing her name spread across social media, #JusticeForEmily, #SayHerName, #TransLivesMatter. For many, Emily became a symbol. Not just of tragedy, but of vulnerability in a world still hostile to truth. But not everyone mourned her. In online forums and comment threads, conspiracy theories and hateful rhetoric thrived. Some painted David Ross as a victim of woke deception, as if being surprised by someone's gender identity was justification for murder. Others used the case to stoke fear, urging for laws requiring full disclosure in relationships. Even in her death, Emily was debated, dehumanized, and misunderstood by some. Meanwhile, David Ross began serving his sentence at the Idaho State Correctional Center. Inside, he kept mostly to himself. Fellow inmates were aware of his crime, most had seen the news coverage. In the rigid hierarchy of prison morality, his label as a woman killer earned him few sympathizers. He filed an appeal, citing emotional distress and ineffective counsel. It was denied within months. Back in Portland, Marcus used the money raised through a viral GoFundMe campaign to establish the Emily Carter Design Fellowship, a grant program supporting young transgender creatives in the digital arts. The first recipient, a 17-year-old trans woman named Zoe, used it to enroll in an art school Emily once dreamed of attending. I never knew her, Zoe said during an interview, but her story made me feel seen. Like someone out there had been through it, and still made something beautiful. Emily's old apartment remained untouched for a while. Her plants withered in the windowsill. Her cat, Junebug, now lived with Marcus. Eventually, her landlord reached out. I don't want to rent it to anyone else, she said. Would you want to preserve it somehow? Maybe turn it into a studio? Marcus didn't have an answer. Not yet. Grief wasn't something you finished. It was something you carried. There are stories that shake the headlines for a week. Others live quietly in the corners of the internet, retold in whispers, never quite fading. Emily Carter's story became both. To some, she was another tragic statistic, another transgender woman murdered in a country where such violence remains shockingly common. But to those who knew her, and to thousands who learned her name in the wake of her death, she became a haunting reminder: love cannot survive where truth is met with hate. She didn't set out to deceive. She set out to connect. To be known. To be loved. She flew hundreds of miles to meet a man she thought might become something more. She brought with her trust, hope, and a fragile kind of courage, one that people like her are forced to develop every day just to move through the world. David Ross didn't see a woman who loved him. He saw a crack in the mirror he'd built around himself. And in that moment, faced with a truth he didn't understand, and couldn't accept, he chose violence. It would be easy to paint him as a monster. Easier still to dismiss him as ignorant, broken, a man from a forgotten town who couldn't handle the complexity of the world changing around him. But the truth is more uncomfortable. David Ross wasn't a monster. He was ordinary. He was the coworker who laughs at the wrong jokes, the neighbor who grumbles about agendas, the man who says he's fine with difference, as long as it stays out of his life. What killed Emily wasn't just one man's hands. It was a culture that teaches masculinity through dominance, that frames trans identity as deception, and that punishes people for stepping outside the narrow lines drawn for them at birth. And in that motel room, on a quiet Idaho night, all of it collided. Emily died trying to live her truth. David killed trying to protect a lie. The verdict didn't bring her back. The sentence didn't ease the ache left behind. But somewhere in a city far from that roadside motel, a young girl now pursues art because of the path Emily carved. Somewhere, someone hears this story and chooses empathy over judgment. Understanding over fear. And that matters. Because the cost of silence is always highest for those who've already been told, again and again, that their truth is too dangerous to be heard. Emily Carter's truth was dangerous, only because it dared to exist. Let her name be known. Let her story be told. Let her be more than what was done to her.